morning is Ophelia Cow. Ophelia Cow directs the Centre for Evidence and Evaluation at New South Wales Treasury. The Centre provides economic analysis, advice to the New South Wales Government, and evidence to put evidence-based policy into practice. The Centre works with agencies to improve the evidence base and helps ensure public funds are directed to the initiatives and social policies that deliver the greatest outcome and public value. Previously, Ophelia has led the Strategic Reform Branch in New South Wales Treasury, covering a broad range of areas including health, justice, energy, climate change and water, and also ran the first pilot of the Washington State Institute model for policy impact assessment in Australia. Before joining the New South Wales public sector, Ophelia led an international program for evidence-based policy on energy in 12 developing and in-transition economies in Europe, Asia and Latin America. She also holds a Master of Science and Master of Public Administration through ANZOG. Ophelia will be presenting today, and then I'll facilitate a Q&A session. You can ask your questions through the chat, and I know Ophelia is also looking forward to receiving your feedback. So I will now hand over to Ophelia.
Thanks, Louisa. Welcome everyone, and also thanks to our contract hosts and get the check working. Thanks to everyone for joining. It's great to see you here. I just reflecting in the year since I last presented to this forum with my colleagues in the Centre for Evidence Evaluation, how much the world has changed. And so I'm especially encouraged to see so many people engaging in policy debates and the like, and having adapted to this kind of forum. Most recently, I recall at the last conference, Peter Struggle was talking us through his observation of what leads to policy failure. While many of his observations attributed policy failure to the absence of consideration of how a policy proposal would actually work or its impacts on people it's designed to serve, and the absence of a program logic, he also observed the problem of assertion being allowed to prevail too often over evidence. But now more than ever, we need policies that work. So I was struck by his comments and reflected on those for my comments today. And those are that you need to minimise the suffering and maximise the welfare of people as best we can with whatever resources we have. And that's more so true now. For that, we have to be able to demonstrate that the policies and projects that we decide on support the social contract between people and the government they elect to make these decisions. As we all know, this then means improving the selection of infrastructure projects and human-centred policies to maximise welfare and lift the economy's productivity and sustainability over time. And we see this commentary in the media on a daily basis, and I think that the issues are magnified in the current context that we're working in. The critical imperative for budget and social repair leaves less room than ever for misplaced efforts, such as those that Peter Struggle was speaking about. So I think it's a directly relevant link between the topics that we're discussing, and some of you may have attended his talk. So as policy professionals concerned with maximising welfare outcomes for the community, how are we faring in showing how our policies do support social priorities in the world as well as in our state? And that leads me to the main subject of today, which is titled, of course, Towards Evidence-Based Policy. On reflection, given that policymakers consider many factors when making decisions, in addition to empirical data, evidence-informed decisions may be a more accurate goal than evidence-based. I'll refer to that from here. So today, I want to take you through three key areas. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen right now, so just bear with me while I find the right file to do that with. That's not it. This is it. So let's put us into presentation mode. If you can't see the screen that I've just shared with the group, someone please let me know. Until then, I'll continue through the slides. There's not many slides, it's mostly a discussion. I want to leave plenty of time at the end as well. So this is the overview of what we're going through today. Three main areas. The first is to run through international developments in evidence-informed policy, and then some next steps for New South Wales, what the implications are, including the work that we're doing to support agencies in capability building, solving technical issues and the like, and linking into policy processes. And then thirdly, lots of room, I hope, for your views and questions. So turning to the first theme, the gains in evidence-informed policy really owe their existence to policymakers like us around the world who've long sought a world in which policy can be demonstrated, not just assumed to make a tangible difference to society. Since about the 50s, the field's founders aimed high, guiding policy and budget choices the government makes by providing objective or more objective information about what works, or at least what stands a fair chance of working, and what is therefore worth funding. Simple program logic and albeit more involved evaluations are key tools for finding this, as we know, but policymakers, as we also know, continue to fund programs despite negative evaluation findings and sometimes eliminate even programs that have been found to be successful. This points to systematic as well as purely technical problems that prevent evidence, even vigorous evidence, from being informing policy, even when it's available. In recent years, we've worked to seek tangible impacts on policy and budget choices by addressing not only the gaps in the evidence, but the policy-making processes themselves that stand to benefit by growing the evidence base. So internationally, there are signs that we are entering quite a new era of commitment to evidence-informed policy making, but it's heterogeneous as advances forward and steps backwards as well. Prominent organisations which exemplify this include the Pew Institute and Washington State Institute for Policy Studies in the United States. And they attest that this will enable governments to identify and eliminate wasteful spending on ineffective or even damaging programs and reinvest this into more beneficial programs. There are examples of such damaging programs and the like, which I have gone through before in different presentations, but I won't get into that much detail today until we're in question time. So what has led to these claims and what does it mean for us? So today we'll just take a whistle-stop tour of the main developments that have fueled the rise of evidence-informed policy making, the challenges and implications for us in New South Wales. And so for this first part, I'll draw on the recent work of a policy leader who's called Gary Van Lundingen, who's formerly of the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, who we've had the benefit of collaborating with on the reform programs here in New South Wales. So I'll convey some of his observations before turning these to the New South Wales context itself. A relatively recent focus on what's often termed what works knowledge enables often more precise assessments of program outcomes than do performance measurement, program review, efficiency dividends, and other budget management tools that are when they're deployed alone. It's important that there have been many gains in how to communicate with policymakers. So I think that you can have all that evidence agreeing about unless it's got very firm instrumental links into policymakers and more user-friendly information, then it will be ineffective in any case. But there are additional factors to those that we're more familiar with potentially, which Van identifies in recent years. First amongst those is achieving a critical mass of curated evidence about what works across social policy areas, growing interest among political leaders in considering information when making choices, albeit for a range of different reasons. Thirdly, new mechanisms for using evidence in the budget process. and fourthly, advances in tools that make it easier to conduct rigorous outcome studies and expand what works evidence. I'll say a little bit more about each in turn. The first factor is featuring critical mass is the growing body of curated evaluation studies. So this comprises thousands of outcome evaluations that have been conducted. And these studies were often unavailable at first to policymakers in years gone by because their findings were either unpublished or they were reported in ad hoc journals and are not available in any one place and inconsistently categorised and the like. So it's very, very difficult and labour intensive to access knowledge by large numbers. So in recent years, this knowledge has been aggregated and curated by research clearinghouses, which is an incredibly important point for New South Wales. And these entities conduct what's called meta-analyses of all relevant evaluations, and they reach conclusions about individual programs, documented effectiveness. So the accessibility there to a wide range of stakeholders, not just policymakers, changes the policy debate and in the public as well as leveling the debate for policymakers. So far as I'm aware, there are about 50 of these clearinghouses now that proliferated in recent years, and they include registries that are operated by academic institutions, governments, as well as the Campbell and Cochrane collaboratives, which many of you probably are most likely to have heard of those, and they also came to visit us here in New South Wales in the last couple of years to talk about their achievements and challenges and discuss the challenges here. The US government sponsors many clearinghouses, such as the Education What Works Clearinghouse, and the Department of Justice in the US runs another one called Crime Solutions. So there's virtually one for every field of social policy. The United Kingdom.
Are we still on the slide two? The audience is wondering.
Yeah, we are, well, I was about to move to slide 3, which I'll leave there for a little while. As I said, it's not very slide heavy, it's more discussion, so just like an example or two for each area of the talk are in the slides, but thank you for checking. So going back to the clearinghouses, they present searchable databases, as I said, with aggregated information. So they often link to websites which enable users to search for it by intervention and across jurisdictions as well, so linking to global evidence bases. They tend to provide evidence guides and tools as well. I'll come back to that a little later. The second key development I mentioned already was the rise in advocacy efforts, and which are led partly by social expectations, but also the need for physical repair, which is a cyclical thing, but never more present or imperative than in the current context that we have now. So, for example, in the US Congress, Conservative Speaker Paul Ryan of the House of Representatives and Progressive Senator Paddy Ryan co-sponsored the Evidence-Based Policy Making Commission to identify opportunities to increase data sharing among federal agencies to support rigorous evaluations, as well as Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Making Act, which requires all federal agencies to establish chief evaluation officers, and similarly, diverse state governments in the US have taken moves such as this. So I guess without going into all of the detail, the point being that there are now statutory requirements in around 30 jurisdictions in the US and in the UK for this kind of evidence to be linking into the budget and policy making cycle. So that requires the mechanisms that will, in the process, as we all know, legislation can achieve certain things, but for adherence there needs to be practice and there needs to be culture as well. So and the actual instruments that work within the administration. So what's So that comes down more to the actual budget processes and what happens inside an annual cycle rather than the legislation itself. Many governments are establishing policies that target a portion of available funding to those programs that meet specified evidence criteria. So this could be done either by act or by regulation. And there are several examples of those sorts of initiatives as well. And basically, all US states now have taken some steps to target funding to evidence-based programs. So 39 of them have established formal definitions to distinguish proven programs from those that lack evidence of effectiveness, and 49 have established mechanisms that target dollars to evidence-based programs. I'll single out the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, which is depicted on the slide on the screen now. As chief amongst these, I suppose the most long-standing one, and it's developed another innovative technique using what works information in the budget process by creating a comprehensive benefit cost model that calculates the return on investment the state could achieve by funding alternative programs. And this model is the one that has really informed all of the other models that have been applied in states of the UK, and where the model's been adapted to local situations. I'll come back to that later. It has been the topic of previous presentations. I won't go into all of the detail here, but from this slide, what we're pointing out is that juvenile arrest rates in that state, in Washington State, were decoupled from national rates when programs were evaluated and funding was directed to the most effective, the demonstrably most effective. This helped to turn around recidivism and reduce crime, but also victimisation and the cost to community, and also to reverse what were significant cost drivers to the state, despite reducing crime rates for decades, as it was in most OECD countries. So there were benefits that accrued to the state, nationally, and to the community, which were demonstrable and the proportion of which could be worked out as well. So we piloted that model in New South Wales with the help of the Washington State Institute. And it works by applying effect sizes derived from the meta-analysis I mentioned before, up to state-specific population and cost data, which is the part that was the New South Wales pilot to get state-specific population and cost data. And so then you can use that to compare interventions across what they do now is 11 social policy areas, including adult and juvenile justice, child welfare, pre-K to 12 education, every area of social policy, substance abuse, healthcare, higher education, workforce development, industry development, everything. And they published reports and rank interventions by the predicted rate on investment that they'll generate for taxpayers and wider society. As I said, over 30 US states have applied this, and I think that trend will continue, which is very hopeful for the comparison of evidence across the world. The fourth factor I mentioned, which is a critically important, is the advanced evaluation tools, and laundering attributes this as well to the rise in evidence, applying evidence-informed policy making. I'll go into some of those tools maybe more in the New South Wales context shortly, rather than focusing on individual tools in the US, which are freely available but probably don't have as much immediate relevance to us at the moment. So I wanted to turn back to New South Wales now, what the challenges are from the international learnings, what the challenges are here and next steps. So we know that the challenges go beyond the scarcity of common problems such as data quality and availability, which we know very well in New South Wales, but they go to growing political polarisation, which has the potential to reverse the progress that we have to date. and systemic incentives to gain evidence or to avoid scrutiny of proposals. First, these efforts face a sometimes polarised political environment and sometimes willingness to dispute inconvenient facts, including evaluation findings. And this has also led to efforts to control the flow of information within and sometimes outside governments. We can probably all point to examples of that. But in the US, one US state has eliminated its evaluation office very recently, while leaders in another state downsized its unit and required reports to be vetted by legislative leadership prior to their release, that kind of thing, or refusal to release evaluation reports or publish them. Another challenge is that there are so-called leaks in the evidence pipeline, such as when evaluation reports can't be located by evidence aggregators. So that happens when evaluation reports are provided to a funding agency or kept within an implementing agency and not available to other users via publications or websites or libraries, let alone the clearinghouses that I referenced before. And that stops clearinghouses from operating, basically. The findings are basically lost to policymakers, and work has to be redone, and expense of evaluation grows and opposition to it, and so forth. This slide here depicts how early work in New South Wales highlighted significant evidence gaps and weaknesses of process to address these. And when the Washington State approach was piloted in New South Wales back in 2015, many of these evidence gaps and process weaknesses were identified in clear detail, and recommendations from this work led to the current reforms for the evidence bank, which some of you will have engaged with already and embedded in work. In effect, the Washington State pilot has provided an early prototype for what would become the evidence bank. It's the clearinghouse. It will be the clearinghouse for New South Wales as it progresses. So, as you'll recall, that was regarded as an integral, important first step for getting to where international best practice is today, and the evidence bank is the prototype for that clearinghouse in the future. You can see on here the timeline for the development of the evidence bank. And the process reforms to support it, which are critical as evidenced from the international developments. So you can see, I guess this really started back in 2015 with the Washington State project. But critical recent developments, just to collapse that timeline come from more later last year. This is after maybe a year and a half of consultation with clusters and where the establishment of the evidence bank and supporting reforms is agreed. And you can see the steps moving forward to, I suppose, the most significant being that evidence bank reports will be integrated into outcome business plan reporting from the 2021 budget. I will turn now to the work that addresses the findings in the international literature about the need for the tools, engagement, capability building. So in New South Wales context, this is, again, centred in, but not wholly comprised of, the work in the Centre for Evidence and Evaluation. So there are critically important capabilities in the clusters as well. If you would have and stock sort of a model, there needs to be, in the eyes of the Audit Office, a centralised function which sort of has a degree of oversight for consistency, but it's not where the expertise for clusters operations exists. In fact, the learning and capability building is a two-way street because most of the time in this small team in the centre, we do not have the operational expertise that exists in the cluster. So while we do have some centralised expertise and technical capabilities that we can access. And having the oversight of the different areas of cluster expertise is a powerful resource for the clusters themselves. And the evidence bank is a way to collect that knowledge to become a resource for clusters as well as for wider government. So I'd like to emphasise that while there are several functions depicted on this slide, such as to assess CBAs and evaluations, and also to set the guidelines, which is in the top right of the slide, which are effectively the evidence standards that are needed to support proposals. Really, by far the biggest thing that we spend our time on is working is the engagement and capability building and building up those enabling tools and working on the processes that feed into budget that support New South Wales answer to what is international best practice. So they're the equivalents of all of the things that were found by the international studies. So I do want to allow plenty of time for discussion and questions. So I'll close with a few remarks about this, and I'd like to just say that, like, collectively, this is an incredibly ambitious agenda. In New South Wales, we're starting from quite, we're growing fast, but in terms of how much evidence we are generating to support our proposals, but we do have quite a long way still to climb as well. But as Ben Landingham, who I quoted earlier, concluded from his research, these steps are essential to ensuring that continuing progress is made towards evaluations founding vision of transparency and assisting policymakers in addressing what are really the fundamental problems facing our community. So the importance of them, of this work, is that couldn't be greater at this particular time when we're entering a period of the need for budget repair, but also, more importantly, I guess, the need for state responses to be highly effective at helping people to re-engage with the economy and to get the best possible services and support that they can. So with that, I would like to open up to discussion, and I will seek to unshare my screen.
The slide has come down and we're now into the questions. So welcome everyone. If you would like to ask a question, can you write it out into the chat with everyone area of WebEx? I can see some questions in there already. And while people are gathering their thoughts, we'll get to that. I have a question for you, Ophelia. I just wanted to know, kind of from a practical perspective, what is it like for line agencies or non-central agencies to work with Treasury and the centre? What information do agencies need to be ready to do that? And what type of skills do they need to have to be able to make best use of the opportunity?
Well, I hope it's an increasingly collaborative experience working with Treasury. I started my time in New South Wales government outside of Treasury and had a view and an understanding of the view that other people had about what that's like working with Treasury. And so we've sought to make this what was once quite an adversarial process. I would describe it as, not always, but quite often adversarial process. We were working very hard to make it much more collaborative, no surprises, and or as few as possible at least. And engaging as early as possible is what we say every chance we get, and working with agencies and clusters to co-develop tools. So by engaging on the technical and practical problems that agencies are having, these conversations often lead to the identification of the need for tools that would make it quicker to interpret guidance and share knowledge and to self-assess proposals so that there's a transparency about how you'd be assessed and why certain evidence standards are there and what the assumptions are behind them. And the evidence bank is a part of that. I could, if I can show my screen again, provide a slide that does contain the main elements of those tools and guidance that we've recently developed. And let's see if I can do that. But while I'm doing that,
we can share it later. Sorry.
I don't know if you can see that now.
Come up now. Yep. Central guidance.
Yeah, that's a list of essential guidance. I'll give you some contacts as well, but basically this is, for the most part, comprises what's known as the investment framework. So what is it that you need to do when you're coming up with a new policy proposal? So we try to make these very practical guidelines, but we've also developed, as I said, tools that are much more brief and can be applied very rapidly. A good example of this is the disaster response guidance that we've come up with, which is really still being refined and reiterated because it did grow so quickly out of necessity. But two examples are rapid assessment and prioritisation of proposals that were needed in response to a series of disasters, drought, bushfire, and COVID. And more recently, a job support calculator, which I can describe a little bit more if that's useful, but in essence, it's in response to the government's commitment to job creation or job support and the need for a way to consistently establish across proposals across a wide range of clusters how many jobs were attributable to interventions. So that could be done incredibly quickly by pretty much anyone once he has established a very sort of simple easy to use calculator. So those are the sorts of things that we try to do to make it easier and to distribute knowledge and not make it not the knowledge of this work something that requires too much technical or previous experience to operate.
Okay, thank you. That's a bit of an insight into what it would be like. One of the most interesting things I think about Australia is that it's relatively uniform, and we have very, relative to other parts of the world, very stable systems of government and common legal systems. There is a lot of opportunities to use evidence from other states and territories in our thinking. Are the findings that, how have you gone in terms of getting information from other states and territories and applying it to New South Wales, or is it that there are specific jurisdictional constraints on doing that? Thinking that there are specific laws that apply in other states and territories we can't apply in New South Wales.
Yeah, we definitely are engaged with the other jurisdictions. And yes, there are constraints on how much cooperation could take place, but that in itself is a topic for discussion as well, given that we are policymakers, accepting that the existing rules are just the existing rules, so we can't do anything more, isn't really how the discussion works, which is fantastic because it's about problem solving and seeing where the blockages are. So the tensions are, of course, commercial incompetence and privacy and data privacy. But we have had these discussions and we've discovered that other jurisdictions are thinking the same way, are very, very keen to leverage off each other and certainly not to reinvent anything. So I suppose a really longer term goal is to work out how to share knowledge a bit more freely, but with the protections that are needed. And the benefits of that would be that, for instance, if there's duplication already between clusters in hiring consultants to do valuation or appraisal work, then the duplication between states is another order of magnitude, and with the Commonwealth again another order of magnitude, which is especially wasteful when in a lot of these situations we'll have comparable cost and population bases because we're in the same part of the world, the same demographics and jurisdictions, comparable potentially. So the aim is to reduce, I guess, one of the barriers to using evidence is that it's cited to be punitive in cost to apply, too time-consuming. But what if you could have a clearinghouse, as they do internationally for these evaluation studies, with the right caveats around privacy and commercial concerns? You could start taking more evidence off the shelf to use quickly. Imagine you wouldn't need to be reinventing the wheel every time around, and things could be done much more rapidly. So this is a long-term aim. We are quite a long way off achieving that here, but the fact that it's been done, I suppose the reason to go through that, the international evidence and developments, is because it proves that it can be done.
Hopefully we can their well trod footsteps. One of the things that we'll probably need to be doing more of is building capability in the sector amongst policy professionals. I guess this is one of the opportunities. So well done, everyone. But how can we really kind of enhance our understanding of using evidence in policy development, particularly, I guess, when it's not a focus necessarily day-to-day of the life of a policy practitioner. They're writing briefing notes or needing to convince a senior executive or the minister of a particular course of action. How can we kind of still take on board and develop our skills in evaluation and using evidence as part of the work that we do?
I guess, in essence, this is what the Audit Office has said the government must do and what the government has said to the Parliament it would do, and which we need to respond each year on progress towards. That said, this isn't a compliance exercise. It's about actually building up capability, not because we're being chased to, but because it's actually quite useful. Going back to the last point, it would be a lot more expensive to have ineffective programs than it would to fund proper appraisal for the right ones, or evaluation for the ones that we've run before. But I guess in that spirit, it's this kind of guidance that we keep developing. So we don't stand by what's on the screen, those guides, and say that's it, that's fixed. We keep working with agencies. We will come and provide workshops on any one of those guides or on the whole investment framework. We'll do workshops on particular problems that come out of those conversations. Clusters say, well, how could you apply that? Because this is quite general, high-level guidance as it applies to the whole cluster. So inevitably what happens is clusters will say to us, we're working on this problem and cannot see how this would apply to that. And we actually don't pretend to know how to do that in the first instance. It requires working together to figure that out. So it's co-developing knowledge, it's utilising the skills from the operating side of government with the skills, the technical skills of the team, and where we don't know the answer, we join up with other jurisdictions and not just in Australia, but in the US, in the UK, New Zealand, until we can find an answer. Last year we were faced with a problem in education capital that we did not know the answer to. Actually, a few different problems, but we were sure that had been tackled somewhere. And sure enough, Her Majesty's Treasury turned out to be the font of all wisdom on this particular technical point, which built up that relationship, had a number of benefits, and they were eager to help because they would like to see their advances taken up elsewhere, and we would too. So I guess this is how I see capability development. It's a co-developed capability. It's not something where an expert tells you how you're going to do it. In your own business, it just doesn't work that way.
That's a good way of approaching things like the practical element. One other good motivator is fear. So I know people in the audience were quite intrigued about you mentioning in the earlier part of the presentation about policies that had done more harm than good, and could that have been avoided? Do you have any examples of how evidence can be used to avoid harm or avoid policies that have a counter intended outcome?
Yeah, certainly. I think this is one of the most surprising parts of this policy area, that it's inconceivable when you start out on this work that there are policies that are running in government that actually either achieve the opposite of their intention or have no effect at all, despite vast sums of money. And I was sceptical when I first heard of this idea, but I've since thought about that, and I can think of lots of examples off the top of my head. But there's one that where it goes to your question precisely, where the Washington State work was so persuasive because they evaluated for outcomes. Their first area of research was really in the recidivism space, and I mentioned that earlier because that was very powerful, and they're launching that into all of the other policy areas because of how effective it was. So when they evaluated the effect on recidivism by actually tracking offenders as they reoffending and as they leave prison of juveniles as well as adults, they found that some who had attended certain programs showed higher rates of recidivism than others, and they were able to actually track those outcomes over years. And there were programs that not only cost the state a lot, but actually they detected an increase in recidivist behaviour. So that doesn't stand to reason until you look at the qualitative research that went into that. It was the assumptions of the people who developed some programs that certain things would convince people that they didn't want to re-enter or enter the prison system. And the people designing the policy were so very different from the people it was designed for. And I think Peter Shergold was talking about this problem in a general sense, that the assumptions that went into it could have been tested if there had been proper program logic and appraisal and some testing with the intended user group, but it actually led to an increase in recidivism and subsequently states starting to divest of this program, which in one state was called Scared Straight. Some people will have heard of that. Interestingly, as I also made the point before, not everyone divested of it because the belief that this worked is that this program worked was very, very strong. It strongly held in certain media sections and the public. So that's where you need to get evidence into the policy making arena. In Washington State, that evidence was required to be considered by the legislature, so that they had to explain, if they didn't take into account the evidence, then they would need to explain why not. So you could have many reasons for that. The evidence is only one input to a decision, but it does place that accountability on decision makers to say why it is saying that equity reasons or distributional reasons or other reasons, strategic reasons could be another basis for not acting on the evidence, but it does place that responsibility on decision makers to explain that to the electorate, that they have the social contract with.
So this is a good addition to our next question. There's one of the growing kind of themes or trends in policy development is to focus more on citizens and individuals and how they perceive and experience government services or the impact of government decisions on their life. How do we incorporate the idea of citizens into our evidence bank and thinking about evidence to inform policy decisions?
I think it's about convincing people of the benefits. So there are risks, and being honest about the risks. There are downsides and upsides, I think, which can't really be overlooked and shouldn't be swept under the carpet. I think you have to build an authorising environment as well as peer support, as well as the capability building that we've already discussed. And without all of those things, any reform effort is likely to collapse. It could make some headway and then collapse. But I think to prepare people for the difficult parts, such as when you begin publishing reports and evaluation findings, probably that first step is the hardest. As it was in the other jurisdictions that I've mentioned. You need to have really clearly explained benefits and convince people of the benefits of making that step. And that takes a very long time. So, and sometimes you'll build that support and then there'll be a change and then you have to start again. So, what you see is a real stop-start kind of progression to this, and that tends to, discourage people. I guess a lot of people in this room have been working in policy a long time with know that policy reform takes quite a long time, and it rarely works the first time. So this is no exception to that. So how do you build the authorising environment? Well, partly it's explaining the burning platform. We kind of already have that. I mentioned the Commission of Audit, the financial audit, the audit report for Parliament. There's a lot of public scrutiny on this space, and that's because of the appetite for being assured that, budgets are going where they'll be most effective. I think it's explaining why assumptions don't work in this space. That doesn't come intuitively to most people, that assertions and assumptions aren't held true. They often assume that they are based on evidence, or it's so obvious to people that something should work that there's no questioning it. And that's hard to do because it's about breaking down misfelt beliefs and cultural change. And then there's the change management piece, which is inherent. It can be, any kind of change can be inherently threatening, so you need to manage that side of things. But I guess, put simply, it's about explaining the benefits to the people of New South Wales, to our authorising environment, and to ourselves who run actual programs and for whom some of this change can be quite threatening.
I want to ask I wanted to ask about this is a question that we got from our audience about other forms of evaluation apart from cost-benefit analysis. What is Treasury's view on using other forms of value for money evaluation for programs where cost-benefit analysis in a traditional sense is difficult to apply?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. It's topical. Well, we tend to try to get a consistent methodology across all of the clusters because that helps to enable prioritisation or understanding, having consistent evidence base. So that recognises that in cost-benefit analysis, not everything can be the values can't always be found for benefits, but they should be in the qualitative description. And to the extent possible, benefit categories should be identified evenly and consistently across different proposals. And so that's sort of step one, even if it's rapid CBA, which is relatively coarse, I guess, in the analysis. That's then part consistent with CBA if proposals tend to move forward. And one of the reasons for that is to minimise the different approaches that enter the system and keep the methodology fit over time as well as across clusters consistent. But it's also to encourage the establishment of options in any proposal. So this goes to the problem I mentioned before about leaping to the answer or the assertion, which we've seen really doesn't always work. But understanding what the problem is and then articulating options for that problem. If you have a problem of congestion, one solution that somebody might say is, well, we need another road. But somebody else, if you went through a CBA step, and this doesn't have to do with monetisation of benefits, this has to do with a thinking process. And you might say, well, you could have a regulatory response, which wouldn't cost anything, or you could have or it might cost something economically, but it might not cost the budget anything, have the same effect. So it's sort of the steps that you go through that are one of the highest values here. That said, if the response is already decided, then cost effectiveness analysis and other forms of analysis can be used, and at different layers of government. Different forms of evidence are appropriate. For instance, in health, you have, clinical-based evidence and randomised control trials and things like that, which are about the efficacy of an intervention towards a given problem. So cost-benefit analysis is really for a whole of government perspective. It doesn't replace those other forms of evidence, and it's a useful thought process, which in and of itself is worth a great deal, regardless of our ability to quantify benefits, which we are trying to grow and work with clusters on to plug those evidence gaps where they exist.
The Commonwealth, for example, the Department of Industry at the Commonwealth level are requiring all new policy proposals to be assessed for evaluation readiness prior to going through decision making. Have you been looking at the Commonwealth level, and is there any learnings that we can take from their processes, procedures, practices?
Yeah, we attach enormous importance to working with our Australian counterparts in other jurisdictions. Consistency of approach is incredibly powerful to help us avoid rework and also avoid differences of analysis across jurisdictions, especially where things are co-funded. We have held a roundtable with all Australian jurisdictions, and we'll probably do that again to share our reforms. Recently I was in Canberra talking to Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Treasury and Finance Unit, who are interested in some of the reforms that we're undertaking now and replicating some of those. In particular, they've been talking to us about the Washington State work, and they're talking about potentially they're incorporating some thinking towards that in some of the reforms. And yes, on their evaluation, we are strengthening ourselves on that side too, to remain as consistent as we can with the other jurisdictions, and not just the Commonwealth, by requiring evaluation plans to be in all of the proposals that are going through at the moment, by requiring recommendations of that sort in all of the COVID, all of the disaster response proposals that went through recently, by engaging with the Productivity Commission on its efforts nationally to come up with a consistent Indigenous policy evaluation framework. So it's various parts of the Commonwealth that we engage with, and other states. We recently heard back from the Northern Territory, who've incorporated our advice into the update of their ex-post evaluation guide. We're currently getting ready to release a second draft of our own evaluation guide, and we look to other jurisdictions to inform the development of that. So there's a lot of different threads to how we engage with other jurisdictions, and it sort of depends on their particular areas. Some of them excel in different areas, and we can all leverage off each other in that way.
So we're pretty close to 11 o'clock now, and I wanted to spend some time thanking our audience for joining us today and hearing about all the great work that the Treasury is doing to look at evidence-based policy, or evidence-informed policy, as we should be saying now. And I wanted to thank Ophelia on behalf of the policy community of practice for sharing today, and I'll also, we didn't get to all the questions, but I'll definitely pass those on to Ophelia, and she can have a look and see if she can get back to you. And we can also share the presentation and then any other material that Ophelia is comfortable with us sharing. And we've also recorded the presentation today, so if your colleagues weren't able to make it, please let them know once the recording is around. So thank you very much, everyone. We've got a lot of thank yous from the audience, Ophelia, to pass on. So thanks for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.